Hello again, I am Dr. Rumsey, and this is a lecture on designing a document or document design. In it, I will go over the CARP principles, which spell out contrast, alignment, repetition, and proximity. Yes, you could rearrange the letters to create the word crap. That's entirely up to you. Let's get started. Basically, document design refers to the text, the graphics, and the spacing on any readable page. This could refer to both a print page, a document, or it could refer to screens of all kinds, including web environments, as well as videos and other types of user interfaces. So, a way to explain the importance of design is to look at this paragraph of information. If you read it carefully, you'll see that it's a description of somebody's credentials that might be applying for a job, right? They obviously have some credentials. They went to Purdue Fort Wayne. They have the Microsoft Certified Database Administrator license or certification, rather. You get the idea. Now look at the same information with a better design. Suddenly, it is skimmable. You can look very quickly to see that this person has 2 degrees, an associate's and a bachelor's, and a certification. You don't have to read the whole paragraph. You can skim it. It's much easier to take in and digest. So, where and how something appears on the page reinforces what appears there. So, for example, we know that this is a letter. If you got this in the mail, you know it's a letter, and you know that in part because of where the stamp is, where the return address, and where the forwarding address is, right? You know those 3 things make up a letter, so that's how we identify it. So there's 4 design principles, as I mentioned before: contrast, alignment, repetition, proximity. These principles were first defined by a woman named Robin Williams in the Non-Designer's Design book, originally 94. I think she has a revision that's somewhere in the early 2000s. I've used the text for years in all kinds of classes. It's a really good book if you're interested in things like web development. Okay, so contrast basically means something that emphasizes difference, right? It's things that are not the same. Alignment means just what it means, things that are lined up, right? And visual connections between items or text. Repetition means if you choose a design element, such as a contrasting element, you use it repeatedly over and over to reinforce the design and make it look coherent. And last is proximity. When you lump light things together, they then go together, and the meaning that is behind them is enhanced. So let's start with proximity. We know, we're back to this letter. This is a former professor at our university. He's now at Michigan State, good friend of mine, Stuart Blythe. We know who the letter is going to and where it is from because of the information and how it's grouped. We know that it's coming from Stuart and going to Phyllis, right? If we didn't, same thing happens here in proximity. We know education happens and is lumped together, and we know certifications because those items are grouped together. They're proximal to one another. Now, what happens, though, if you don't have good proximity? Your spacing in your resume, for example, is off a little bit. Well, notice how all of a sudden it's a heading certification, but because it's lumped up in the education category, your eye doesn't see it the same. You kind of skim over it, and then you're like, wait, what happened? And you notice those little things. And these are small things, but can make a really big difference, particularly in a document like the resume. It's those small elements that readers are going to notice, wow, this is a really well put together document. They may not know why they think it's really well put together, but you know, and it's attention to these kinds of details. So alignment, it means things that line up, right? So we're back to this now. Apparently I am writing to Phyllis, and you see how there's 2 alignments on this page, one on the far left and one in the center. If you don't have good alignment, this one is a diagonal alignment. If you think about it, it goes from the top left to the bottom right. It's not very streamlined. It's also the proximity of the information is incorrect. So what would happen in this is that the computerized systems that the mail service has may not read this very well, and they'd spit it out, and it would have to be decided by an actual human person instead of the robot that can look for the information because it's grouped appropriately and aligned appropriately. So a classic alignment that a lot of you may not think about is the decimal point. Back again, sorry about that. One of the things in alignment that you're familiar with, but maybe you haven't thought about in a long time, is back when you had to add decimal places, you line the decimal place up, right? So it's in the middle of something. It's kind of a rare thing to have something aligned in the middle of the text rather than flush left, flush right, that sort of thing. But this is a good example. Alignment and proximity kind of work together also. So if things are aligned, you know they go together. Here's an example of some information, right? It all seems kind of random on the page. We know it goes together because it's on the same page, but if it's aligned, it looks much more cohesive, much more tight. It looks a lot more professional. So let's go back to the other one. So that, but if we align it, it looks different. It looks better. So this is a good thing to keep in mind for presentations, for example. Here's another alignment. In your resume, you're going to want to make sure that every single alignment is exactly right. So that, look here, your title is flush all the way to the left, and then like a few spaces in or a tab in for all the information that are under that category. And if you're consistent with those alignments, again, it has that professional quality people can't put their finger on, but it really does make a difference. Now, repetition is when you select a design element that you continually use that same design element so that it provides cohesion and uniformity in the document. Here we've selected a boldface sans serif font for the headings, and then the content under the headings is in a serif font, maybe Times New Roman, and it's different so that you see that there's different things there. Contrast. A couple things to keep in mind with contrast. Larger objects are going to always appear more important than smaller ones. So on this page, your eye automatically is going to go to contrast, the word, plus it's red, so there's that difference in the contrast. It's different than the other text on the page, plus it's larger. Thicker objects are more important than thinner, so if something's boldface, people's eye is going to go to that first. And objects in the foreground are more important than those in the background. And here I like to think of like a Bob Ross painting and how he'd start with those really far away mountains, and then all of a sudden he's putting a slash, this big brown slash, the whole thing, and you realize later that it's a tree that's really up close. That's what I'm talking about. So you need to make sure that there's sufficient contrast or adequate contrast between things. So on this white background, black content is the classic contrast, black and white. It's the most extreme opposites. If you use this pale gray or blue, it doesn't have really enough contrast. Some people's eyes may not pick it up. Here's another example down here with the Boilermaker Special for those of you who are Purdue main campus fans. The yellow shows up really clearly when it is over the black of the train, but when it goes over onto the white portion of the screen, you can't see it nearly as well. Okay, a couple things about font choices, particularly for your resume. Boldface is an appropriate thing, underlining is an appropriate thing. But if you notice italics actually aren't as useful as you might think for providing contrast, because if you think about, this is probably before a lot of your time, but dot matrix printers back in the day used to print according to dots. They would actually dot out all of the text that you had asked it to print. And if you italicized something, it used fewer dots. It literally used less ink. And so then it automatically fades to the background. And so if you're reading along, try reading a text sometime and notice that, wait, italics sort of almost appears gray compared to the other text. So I would encourage you to use boldface or underlining for sufficient contrast in your resume. Font size and style can be used that. Remember back again, I mentioned before, there's two different fonts here. There's boldface. You get the idea. And that is it. So keep in mind that these are the small details that can make a big difference in making your presentation and your resume really awesome.